for national interest, India is being asked, are you funding this war?
So, look, I mean, I don't want to sound argumentative, but then tell me if buying Russian gas is not funding the war? I mean, why is it's only Indian money and oil coming to India which funds, but it's not gas coming to Europe which funds? I mean, look, somewhere, I mean, let's be a little even-handed out.
Issues with China. How do you think you'll be trusted by others after that? Why do you think anyone will help Delhi after you didn't help others over Ukraine?
It's an interesting question which you might, I mean, not you, meaning you personally, but people might want to ask themselves, because if I were to take Europe collectively, which has been singularly silent on many things which were happening, for example, in Asia, you could ask, why would anybody in Asia trust Europe on anything at all? Today, Europe is buying oil. Europe is buying gas. I just read the new package of sanctions. Now, the package is designed in a way in which consideration has been given to the welfare of the population. So, pipelines have a certain carve-out. And timelines have been given. It's not like tomorrow morning everything's going to be cut off. So, people need to understand, if you can be considerate of yourself, surely you can be considerate of other people. So, if that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems. That it's happened way before anything happened in Ukraine. We have a difficult relationship with China. We're perfectly capable of managing it. It's if I get global understanding and support, obviously it is of help to me. But this idea that I do a transaction, that I come in one conflict because it will help me in conflict too, that's not how the world works. So a lot of our problems in China have nothing to do with Ukraine, have nothing to do with Russia. They predate it.
Are you planning to not pick a side?
No, I'm sorry. That is exactly where I disagree with you. This is the construct you are trying to impose on me, and I don't accept it. I mean, I don't think it's necessary for me to join this axis or not, and if I'm not joining this, I must be with the other one. I don't accept that. I mean, I think I'm 1/5 of the world's population. I am, today, the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. I mean, forget the history, civilization bit, everybody knows that. But I think I'm entitled to have my own side. I'm entitled to weigh my own interests, make my own choices. And my choices will not be cynical and transactional, but they will be a balance of my values and my interests. There is no... I actually made 2 points. One, how the world is changing. It is rebalancing. It is less Euro-Atlantic. I don't think everybody gets that. I think old habits die hard. I mean, very candidly, there are still people in the world who believe that their definition, their preferences, their views must override everything else. So, since you mentioned this specific example, I don't know how familiar people are with what was said at the Munich conference. Essentially, Mr. Soros said India is a democratic country, but he doesn't think the Prime Minister of India is a Democrat. By the way, a few years ago, in the same conference, I was there at that time, he actually accused us of planning to strip millions of Muslims of their citizenship, which of course didn't happen. It was a ridiculous suggestion. But you have to understand what this actually means. I could take a view that the individual in question, Mr. Soros, is a old, rich, opinionated person sitting in New York who still thinks that his views should determine how the entire world works. Now, if I could only stop at old, rich and opinionated, I would put it away. But he is old, rich, opinionated and dangerous, because what happens is when such people and such views and such organizations, they actually invest resources in shaping narratives. I spoke about globalization.
Now, what globalization does is, it actually creates lot of the seamlessness of globalization, which creates all the opportunities, also allows narratives to be shaped, money to come in, foundations to go about their agenda. Now, in this particular case, I mean, it is very clear that he has very strong political preferences. He actually thinks that, I mean, doesn't matter that this is a country of 1.4 billion people, we are almost there, whose voters decide how the country should run. He actually thinks, well, if, and again, I cite him as an extreme example, okay, but there are other, manifestations of this in different countries, where people like him think an election is good if the person we want to see wins. If the election throws up a different outcome, then we actually will say it's a flawed democracy. This to my and the beauty is, all this is done under the pretense of advocacy of open society, of transparency, etc. So our generation, we have grown up with concepts like regime change, which influence operations. Now, you can call it what you will. I mean, to me, this really looks the same, with a gloss of some kind of do-goodism on it. So, for me, it's actually necessary today that we have today a serious conversation on democracy. When I look at my own democracy, I mean, I have today a voter turnout which is unprecedented, electoral outcomes which are decisive, electoral processes which are not questioned. We are not one of those countries where after the election somebody goes to arbitrate in court. Okay? We don't have any hanging chads either. And where you actually say, I will sit in judgment over the verdict of voters. Now, my sense of democracy is the voter is supposed to decide. And it worries us because, look, we are a country which went through colonialism. We know the dangers of what happens when there is outside interference in whatever guise in your politics. If you do this kind of scaremongering, like millions of people will be deprived of citizenship, it actually does real damage to our societal fabric, because somebody out there believes you, and you don't leave it to accident, by the way, you back it up with an operation. So you create that kind of fear psychosis, and then you use that to validate your original judgment. So I do think today, between whose democracy, whose globalization, why the transparency of how global processes work, these are real issues which need to be.
1,000 people from India have applied for political asylum in Austria. For several months, there was no other country with more asylum seekers here. How would you explain that?
Well, I mean, I don't know the numbers. If you say so, I have to take you at your word. But my sense is that when it comes to irregular migration, sometimes, because these are done by syndicates and gangs, you never know where they end up with. I think what's important is not what happened in the past. It is that we have a commitment to ensure that movement and mobility is legal. We would like a regime, an agreed regime for that. It's good for the global workplace. It's good for the Austrian economy. And we have, that's one of the outcomes of my visit to Vienna.
Another outcome is that you have assured Austria's foreign minister that India will take back all of these citizens who will not get asylum in Austria, which will probably be almost 100%. How fast will this happen?
Look, in terms of our citizens, if they're proven to be our citizens, we obviously have an obligation in that regard. But what is important for us is to validate the fact that if there's somebody who's staying illegally, that they are our citizens.
And
if there are citizens, usually
we work it out between the governments concerned. I can't give you a time frame on it because it depends on what is the level of proof that is provided for us and what are the preparations on the Austrian side.
So you did not agree on a time frame today?
No, we didn't. Frankly, we didn't get into that kind of discussion. That is for the immigration people to decide. As foreign ministers, what we did was to work out an agreed mobility and movement regime. So we were looking for solutions. We weren't into the details of returnees' problem. That there are other people whose jobs it is to do that.
Let's talk about the war in Ukraine. As you are well aware, the whole world noticed that India, as a very influential country, has never publicly condemned Russia's assault and invasion into a neighboring country. Why is that so? Can you really be neutral in a war for which obviously one side bears all responsibility?
Well, look, I think in international relations, you have sometimes very complicated situations. And where we are concerned, we have always taken the position that the way out is for the countries concerned to get back to dialogue and to diplomacy.
I'll come to that soon, but is this a complicated situation? Is this really complicated? There's just one big country invading its neighbor.
No, look, I can give you many instances of countries who have violated the sovereignty of another country. If I were to ask where Europe stood on a lot of those, I'm afraid I'll get a long silence. So do understand one thing. At the end of the day, we make judgments in foreign policy based on what we think are our long-term interests and what is good for the world.
But you and Prime Minister Modi have already said that regularly call on both sides to stop the war and to negotiate. However, can one really urge Ukraine to stop defending itself? After all, there are no Ukrainian tanks in Russia. There are Russian tanks and planes and missiles destroying Ukraine.
I think that's a bit of a misrepresentation. I think what we do is to say, get back to dialogue and diplomacy. There was dialogue and diplomacy in the early days of the conflict. So it's not that it didn't happen. So it's not for us to put conditions and to say this country is equal to that country. That's your judgment.
But should you urge Russia to stop the war?
I think we have been very clear that this conflict is not in anybody's interest, including theirs.
But you wouldn't say it more explicitly?
I'm a diplomat. It is my job to conduct foreign policy which serves my national interests and which serves what I believe is a long-term pathway towards peace and dialogue.
Let's talk about India's interests. India does not take part in Western sanctions against Russia, but has increased its imports from Russia 5 times since the war began. By this, are you not helping Moscow? Are you not financing Russia's war?
Europe imported in the same period 6 times the energy which India did. So
Europe decreased its imports a lot and dramatically since the war started. You multiplied yours.
No, essentially, if it is a matter of principle, why didn't Europe cut on the first day? Why didn't we see on 25th of February a complete cutoff of energy imports from Russia? You can't say it's my principle, but by the way, I will do it by my timing.
Okay, but isn't it the difference between decreasing your imports but still making sure that Europe is not freezing to death in the winter, or just increasing your imports by 5 times?
No, Europe has managed to reduce its imports while doing it in a manner in which it is comfortable for Europe.
Comfortable?
It's manageable.
It's manageable. Maybe a little bit of an
It's manageable. Now, if at 60,000 euros or whatever is your per capita income, you are so caring about your population. I have a population at $2,000. I also need energy. I'm not in a position to pay high prices. The price of oil has doubled. And what Europe is doing is also moving into the Middle East and diverting production out of the Middle East into Europe and raising prices. So European actions actually are putting pressure on the global oil markets and on my imports as well. So I think it's something which, if European political leadership understandably would like to soften the impact on their population, I think it's a privilege they should extend to other political leaderships as well.
Are you reluctant toward Moscow as well, because Russia is India's most important supplier of weapons and military equipment?
And therefore?
Are you reluctant to criticize Moscow?
No, I think, look, we have a relationship with Moscow. We've had a long-term relationship with Moscow. I think it's important to look at that history of the relationship. It was a relationship built in a period when Western democracies used to arm a military dictatorship called Pakistan and deny India defensive weapons. So if we are talking about principles, let's talk a little bit of history out here. So how did the Indian exposure to Russia and previously to Soviet Union get built up? Because the Western democracies, for whatever reason, decided that their natural partner in our part of the world was a military dictatorship.
Would you consider India an ally of Russia?
No, I think India doesn't. We are an independent country. We do not define ourselves or perceive ourselves in alliance terms. That's very much a Western terminology. It's not something. It's not a term that we use.
Before you said you're a diplomat, but several weeks ago you called Pakistan, your neighbor, the epicenter of terrorism.
Well, I did it again today without using the word Pakistan.
Yes, and this doesn't sound very diplomatic, does it?
No, because you are a diplomat doesn't mean you're untruthful. I could use much harsher words than epicenter. So believe me, considering what has been happening to us, I think epicenter is a very diplomatic word, because this is a country which has attacked the Parliament of India some years ago, which attacked the city of Mumbai, which went after hotels and foreign tourists, which every day sends terrorists across the border.
But of
so
course,
sometimes
not,
when
but
we
of
talk,
course not as a country.
well, if you control your sovereign space, which I believe they do, if the terrorist camps operate in broad daylight in cities with recruitment and financing, can you really tell me that the Pakistani state doesn't know what's going on? Especially if they're being trained in military level combat tactics. So, you know, when we speak about judgments and principles, why don't I hear sharp European condemnation of these practices which have been going on for multiple decades?
Does the world have to be concerned that there someday will be a war between India and Pakistan?
I think the world has to be concerned that there is terrorism going on, and the world often looks away. The world often feels it's not my problem because it's happening to some other country. I think the world needs to be concerned about how sincerely and strongly it takes up the challenge of terrorism.
But has the world to be concerned about the future war between India and Pakistan?
I think the world needs to be concerned about terrorism.
That's
because,
what you said.
Yeah, sure. Because look, if you pose it the way you do, that's like giving a free pass to terrorism, saying, you know, let's worry about the next consequence of it. I'm worried about the terrorism.
Okay, let's change the subject. You frequently said that India has a very complicated relationship with your neighboring China. Many people around the world are quite concerned that China might, in the near future, intervene militarily in Taiwan. Do you share this concern?
I think there's a larger concern which is based on our experiences. The concern is that we had agreements with China not to mass forces in our border areas. And they have not observed those agreements, which is why we have the currently tense situation that we do. We had an agreement not to unilaterally change the line of control, which they have tried to unilaterally do that. So there is, I think, a perception that we have, which derives directly from our experiences. Now, where else the status quo may change or not change, I would hesitate as a foreign minister to predict publicly. I may have my own views and assessments. But I certainly can share my experience, and my experience is that written agreements were not observed, that we have seen levels of military pressure which in our view has no justification.
China would say the opposite. They would say that India had not obeyed different agreements. but obviously you see it
no, I
otherwise.
think it's difficult for China to say that for this reason. The record is very clear because today, there's a lot of transparency. You have satellite pictures. If you see who moved the forces to the border areas first, I think the record is very clear. So it's very difficult for China to say what you suggested they could.
India will probably overtake China as the world's most populous country within this year. Is this fact of any political significance to India, or is it just a mere statistic?
We'll know that when we reach there, won't we? Yeah, because we have never used numbers in that manner. Maybe other countries have. I would still say to a large extent it is a statistic, but you will have a situation where the world's most populous country is not among the permanent members of the Security Council. And what does it say about the state of the UN if that is the case? So it's a kind of both a yes and a no. It's partly a statistic, but I think it's a statistic which means a lot.
For several years, you have called for a permanent seat on the Security Council, as have Brazil, as has Japan or Germany. How long will it take, from your point of view, till this reform of the Council will actually become reality?
Well, ideally, we'd like it yesterday.
Of course.
But the problem, I think, is that those who are today enjoying the benefits of permanent membership clearly are not in a hurry to see reform. I think it's a very short-sighted view, in my opinion, because at the end of the day, the credibility of the UN and, frankly, their own interest and effectiveness is at stake. So my sense is it will take some time, hopefully not too much time. I can see a growing body of opinion among UN members who believe that there must be change. It's not just us. You have entire Africa, entire Latin America left out. Developing countries vastly underrepresented. I think the state of the world, this was an organization invented in 1945. It's 2023.
And when you would have to guess for a year when this will happen, what would it be?
No, I wouldn't guess because I know the complexities of this process. It's a tough one. I'd be honest with you. It's a tough one, but I don't think because it's a tough one we should give up. On the contrary, I think because it's a tough one, we should actually up the ante, increase the feeling in wide parts of the world that this reform is absolutely essential.
Thanks so much for your time.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure. A cooperative, inclusive, and consultative approach to international relations. We believe that multipolarity, rebalancing, fair globalization, and reformed multilateralism cannot be kept in abeyance. The call for reformed multilateralism, with reforms of the Security Council at its core, enjoys considerable support among UN members. It does so because of the widespread recognition that the current architecture is anachronistic and ineffective. It is also perceived as deeply unfair, denying entire continents and regions a voice in a forum that deliberates their future. India is prepared to take up greater responsibilities, but it seeks, at the same time, to ensure that the injustice faced by the Global South is decisively addressed. Our call is to allow serious negotiations on such a critical matter to proceed sincerely. They must not be blocked by procedural tactics. Naysayers cannot hold the IGN process hostage in perpetuity. In these turbulent times, it is essential that the world listens to more voices of reason and experiences more acts of goodwill. India is willing and able on both counts. We believe and advocate that this is not an era of war or of conflict. On the contrary, it is a time for development and for cooperation. Madam President, in the past, this august assembly has served as a meeting point of views and as a catalyst for action. It is vital that we continue to believe in the promise of diplomacy and the need for international cooperation. Therefore, Madam President, let us strive to return to the course of seeking peace, progress, and prosperity. I thank you.